Welcome to episode 5 of the Unpolitician podcast with me, Ralph Farrow. Now today we are joined by a very special guest. He's a former Member of Parliament for Carmarthen West and South Pembrokeshire and the former Chief Whip in the Rishi Sunak government. He is the author of this new best-selling book, Ungovernable, The Political Diaries of a Chief Whip. It is of course Lord Simon Hart. Simon, thank you very much for joining us, we do appreciate it.
Not at all. Pleasure.
Great to have you on. So, given the fact that the Whip's office is traditionally shrouded in secrecy, why have you chosen to publish this book at this time?
Yeah, I think we sort of try and address that on almost page 1 of the book, because it is one of the sort of great traditions of the Whip's office, and nobody ever says anything to anybody about anything. And that's all very honourable and very sort of, it sounds good. But in reality, all that really, for me, what that results in is an exercise in sort of potentially denial. We just sort of almost can pretend nothing's going wrong, nothing to see here, everything's going swimmingly, and failing, which I think was a contributory factor to why we lost the election last year, by the way, failing to hold a mirror up and take a long, hard look at it, and however sort of uncomfortable that process might be. And I think the idea that we just were the office that quietly dealt with things and nobody would ever be seen or heard, or no issue would ever be seen or heard outside that, I'm afraid is a bit outdated. I mean, obviously I've tried to make the book interesting without being really breaching too many competences, or indeed any competence actually. But the reality is, what was going on in our party, which we were witnessing on the inside every day, was wearing very, very thin with the public. And unless we address that, we will continue to have avoidable difficulties in the future. And that's really what lay behind. The other things which lay behind the book, which was how did we go from sort of hero to zero in 4.5 short years. But we can talk about that separately.
In going through your book, it's interesting to analyse what you mean by the title, because Ungovernable, when you read through all your different diary entries, it sounds like you're referring to the Conservative Party, but are you referring to the Conservative Party or the country, or perhaps both?
I think I'm referring to Parliament, and I think I'm referring to government in the round. I think it was deliberately provocative in terms of I knew everybody would assume that I was referring to my own party. Actually, as we've seen with the difficulties and the turbulence and headwinds that Keir Starmer has encountered, the problems we had are by no means unique to us. And I think that there's a combination of factors that lie behind it. Partly, I think we're not equipping some really good people for life in politics or life in government as well as we should. And that's a problem. I think we are at the mercy of an increasingly demanding sort of social media atmosphere, which creates first an appetite for instant gratification. And thirdly, I think governments, my own included, are guilty from time to time of making promises which are impossible to keep, and which therefore lead, expectation management. We come up with a slogan, we suggest, as Keir Starmer did, that, all you need to do is vote Labour and all your problems would go away free of charge. Yeah. That was never possible.
So the book the entries start in December of 2019, obviously during that election campaign. Can you give us a rundown of your political career up to that point?
Yeah, it was relatively normal. I was elected in 2010, Labour seat up till then of Carmarthen West and South Pembrokeshire. It came our way in the sort of David Cameron election, so we went in under David's premiership and the coalition. I was talking to somebody this morning, it seems like I would never have thought at the time that the calmest, most sort of measured, trouble-free, stress-free, steady, reliable, consistent period of our political history was when we were actually in coalition with the Lib Dems. At the time, that coalition felt like it was the biggest thing with biggest political challenge we would ever have our lives. Turned out to be the easiest few years any of us can remember. So I did back in those days. I did a lot of sort of select committee stuff. I did DEFRA, I did DCMS, I did Wales, I did Constitutional Reform, a committee which was sort of abolished after the Lib Dems left government. And I did all the stuff that backbenchers often do in their first few years, which is concentrate on the constituency. Mine was always marginal at best. And then it was only really in 2019 when everything started to change so dramatically, so quickly, that I ended up in the Cabinet Office in a mysterious job, which was called the Minister for Implementation, which I don't think anybody much had ever heard of, including me and indeed Boris Johnson, when he rang up to tell me that was my job, that we both were scratching our heads and hoping somebody would tell us what it meant. And then that actually didn't last particularly long, because there was an election and the vacancy in the Wales office came up, and I was happened to be in the sort of right place at the right time for once, and that's sort of where the book starts on December, the landslide victory of December 2019, and as they finishes 4.5 short years later with the landslide defeat in July of last year.
Were you expecting that appointment at the Wales office then?
Well, yes, and you could never be certain with these things. It had come about as a result of a rather unexpected resignation of the then Secretary of State, Alan Cairns, who got, in a sense, in one of those very difficult positions where there was a very difficult news story, which was around about the time of the election campaign, and Alan, although nobody was pointing an accusing finger at him in any sense, he was just I used the expression I was in the right place at the right time. Earlier on, Alan was in the wrong place at the wrong time and had no option really but to stand down, and we only have 12 at the time. We only had 12 MPs in Wales, most of whom had been Secretary of State, as far as I can tell. So it was almost in the process of elimination. There was nobody left other than me, and so that made that the gene pool from which that position is selected is quite a small one. So I sort of knew I was in the show.
So the excitement of the 2019 election victory and also your appointment in the Wales office is slashed by the appearance, obviously, of the COVID-19 virus. Now, from somebody who was sitting around the cabinet table when strategy was being formed, how did the government respond, and what was the response like from somebody that was actually seeing it happen in real time?
Well, you're right. It upended everything. Everything changed, and we're still obviously living with the consequences of that, those few years. And it is difficult to describe quite what a profound impact that had on absolutely everything. So all of the plans for government, everything that Boris Johnson wanted to achieve, everything that we as a government wanted to achieve, was instantly, at best, put on hold, and at worst, probably damaged to the extent that we could never follow that agenda anymore, because the national finances and the overall political picture changed so drastically, so quickly. And I think, when I look back at that, and I know there is a sort of microscopic analysis of decisions which were good ones or bad ones at the time, all of those retrospective sort of analyses are with the benefit of hindsight. At the time, very few of us in government, and I include officials in that, knew what this disease was capable of, or the pace at which it would spread across the globe, the impact that it would have on the economy, and the potential sort of catastrophic effect on society that we were desperate to avoid. And so, I do attempt to just offer a few words of defence, if you like, in Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock. Some of these people have become the villains of the peace. In their defence, they didn't have a lot of options. And when you're sitting in the cabinet room, as we did, and the chief medical officer and the chief scientific officer and other experts in both medical and behavioural science are saying to the cabinet, this is a disease which is capable of wiping out large proportions of the population. It isn't particularly discriminate in terms of, we didn't think at the time, age and background, and that the NHS would be overwhelmed, and that there would be all sorts of catastrophic impact on people who might not have got COVID but were relying on the NHS for other treatment, and that we didn't have sufficient mortuary facilities, for example, to cope with the anticipated level of mortality. I don't believe there's a prime minister in any party, in any moment in history, who would have reacted differently to the way in which we did at the time. Because as politicians, if you're faced with the advice, and the only advice we had at the time, that unless we took a certain course of action, it would be the responsibility for excess deaths and disease and all of the sort of economic catastrophes which come with that. I defy anybody to say that we would have turned around and ignored that advice. It would have been, I don't think any politician would have done that. So when people, mutter about, was it right that we had lockdown? Did we go in too early? Did we go in too late? Did we stay in too long and all that? Just bear in mind, we were processing a vast amount of international information, and the advice we were getting at the time from people who really did know their stuff, really, we didn't think left us with any options at all.
So if we look particularly at Boris Johnson, it's a fascinating case study because in his past writing for The Telegraph, he sort of self-styled himself as more of a libertarian about these type of things. So did you expect some sort of resistance from his perspective on the lockdown measures, sort of preserving individual freedom, personal responsibility?
I think I touched on this a bit in the book, because actually it was my observation that Boris absolutely hated the concept of lockdown. I think it was the last thing he wanted to do. And I even went as far as thinking at the end of when we'd had the first lockdown, thinking to myself that Boris would rather resign as Prime Minister than go into a second lockdown, because it went against all of his instincts. You're absolutely right. His libertarian instincts, his economic instincts, his political instincts. No, and to be fair to other people, almost everybody around the table, this was a last resort rather than a first option. Yeah. Nobody wanted this to happen. Everybody realised that this was going to, turn the country upside down. It was going to drive a coach and horses through the economy. It was going to require us to do things like furlough or business interruption loans, which had never been done before. We're going to have long tails. And indeed, we're still, the famous or infamous black hole, which Rachel Reeves goes on about all the time. If such a thing exists, that wasn't a consequence of economic mismanagement. It was a consequence of absolutely unforeseen and unforeseeable circumstances and the impact of COVID, followed by Ukraine, but COVID in the first instance on the UK economy. So this thing is still perched on our shoulder, making our life uncomfortable. But you're right. None of us wanted to do this, and in particular, I think Boris was very found in a very uncomfortable process, which reinforces my view that he only took these decisions because he felt there was no reasonable alternative, rather than just lurching into it because it was the course of least resistance. That was never the case.
Yeah, I think that would probably be the difference between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. The Labour Party, perhaps with some degree of glee, would look at the lockdown situation and be more than happy to impose that, whether the Conservative Party is more focused on individual freedom and personal liberty, so they'd be a bit more resistant.
I think there was some ideological differences, and don't forget, one of the things that I was wrestling with at the time was that COVID response was a devolved matter. So we did have a Labour government in Wales, which was attempting to do things differently. By the way, but relying on UK government and the UK Treasury to underpin all of that, it's the nature of the Revolution Agreement. But there was definitely there were some quite ideological differences, I think, between the approach.
So you touched on there your relationship with the Welsh First Minister, Mark Drakeford. How do you think he handled matters around COVID, and how did you deal with him personally?
There was a genuine attempt at the beginning of all of this to act in a collegiate way. I think the relationship was strained, and I think with the UK government and Welsh as well as Scottish governments, we were dealing with Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland, Mark Drakeford as well. And it did seem, and people have debated this, but it did seem to me that there was a frustratingly evident amount of sort of political opportunism, and there were numerous occasions where Welsh government would sort of shed crocodile tears and say, well, if only UK government would do what we've done, or if only UK government would put more money into the system, and Drakeford was inclined to always say, well, look, I'm only trying to do the right thing here. I'm only trying to save lives, and but I'm being held back by that scoundrel Boris Johnson in London. And there was and in a sense you could justify a different approach if the levels of infection and the levels of death were materially different under the Welsh Labour government's approach to COVID than they were under UK government's approach. But that was never the case. And if you look at the numbers since, and aiming off for the fact that the population of Wales is probably rather different than the population of the rest of the UK, and definitely different from the population of London in all of its essential details. Aiming off of that, basically, the numbers in Wales reflected the numbers everywhere else in the UK, and there was no noticeable difference, despite the fact that there was always this sort of rather, I thought rather sort of contrived sort of difference of doing things, and for me, one of the essential ingredients of national compliance and understanding and support for the government was based on simplicity and consistency of message. And where you had a situation where where it just happened to be every week, as my train trundled under the Severn Tunnel between Newport and Bristol Parkway, the public announcement would be, you may now remove your mask, or you now have to put on your mask. That kind of sort of pointless additional complexity and complication, I just don't think did anything for the national sort of support for this pretty intrusive scheme that we were attempting to implement. I think it just gave people reason to think, oh God, I wish can't they even agree on masks? There was that kind of exasperation in public, and so it was difficult, and I think for all his I'm only trying to save lives attitude of Mark Drakeford, he never missed an opportunity to stick the knife into Boris Johnson, and at that time I think that was a fairly irresponsible thing to do.
Yeah, I think if we had a Labour government in England, he'd be far more cooperative and wonderful in his praise of what Keir Starmer would be doing, obviously, with Boris Johnson. And it'd be
it's very interesting in the wider politics. Since the election last year, there has been a Labour government in England as well as in Wales, and guess what? It hasn't changed anything very much. In fact, it's just made it very difficult for Welsh government to do what they always did with us, which is to say, and they used to describe us rather disparagingly as the London government, with a sort of, with a barely concealed level of contempt and sort of criticism. They can't do that now, and I think UK government's discovering that the relationship is difficult. across a number of different fields.
Yeah, I think Keir Starmer likes to point to Wales as his blueprint. I believe he described Wales as that, talking about that's what we want England to be, but perhaps not the best example given what they've done on health and education.
But he did, and the extraordinary thing about that, it always used to sort of baffle us, because on all the things from which governments are normally measured, which is economic performance, health service, and educational achievement, to name but three, the results in Wales were always worse than they were anywhere else.
Yeah.
So they were bottom of the league as far as educational outcomes were concerned. Even they'd been in government 22 years. It's not just they'd come in and they were still getting to grips with it. They'd been in since devolution was created in 1997. And like what so by now there should have been some evidence that the Labour way of doing things in terms of education and health in particular should have borne some fruit. But it hadn't. So I was astonished when Keir Starmer said it's a blueprint. I thought, God, I hope not. Literally, if he wanted the lowest common denominator, he need look no further than Wales. And yet he was trying to say this was a model that he admired and aspired to. Well, I mean, judging on what's going on at the moment, perhaps he did aspire to it. But it's complete nonsense to suggest some Wales or some, achieving great things. And by the way, that was on a 20%, 20% higher funding settlement than anywhere else in the UK, actually, what Scotland had. But for every pound spent in England on education, £1.20 was spent in Wales. So they even had more money to do the things that they wanted to do, and still the results were worse in Wales than they were in England, and that was very frustrating.
The argument never seems to be responsibility for your own citizens. It's always yearning for more money. I never heard Mark Drakeford going out there saying, well, educational outcomes are low, that's my responsibility. I always heard him saying, well, the London government aren't giving us enough money, therefore the educational outcomes aren't good.
Yeah, that was absolutely the standard stock answer to literally every single problem it could have been. It didn't matter what it was. It was always, the London government are underfunding us. Wales is, being hard done by, crumbs from the rich man's table and all of that.
Yeah.
Which was simply untrue. And also, by the way, we did, from time to time, goad Welsh government by one of the things which Welsh government has the power to do is to set its own rate of income tax, but it never has. And of course, one thing that it could have done in all of this is to raise income tax, particularly for higher rate taxpayers, in order to resolve the problem which Mark Drakeford was referring to about underfunding. It had the power to do that, but it took in all of the years that it was in office, it never actually did it. There's a very simple solution to that. Actually, they didn't want to remove the ability to blame UK government, and they didn't want to incur the wrath of taxpayers in Wales, nor did they want to drive taxpayers. We don't have many high rate taxpayers in Wales, so it wouldn't, even if they'd done it, they wouldn't have raised much money. But it would be very easy to pop across the border from Newport or Wrexham or Deeside or wherever it might be, and relocate on the English side of the border and actually and do away with any advantage that tax rise might have had. But the fact is, they would not put their money where their mouth was. They wouldn't ever take responsibility for raising the money that they insisted on spending. And it always riled a sort of serious, all of us really, that for devolution, if they really wanted devolution to be applied, if you like, in its literal sense, then they ought to have taken responsibility for raising the money that they felt so passionately about spending. But they'd never do it. They would never do it. And we often used to offer them, we used to sort of almost jokingly offer them the opportunity, but they had the power, but they didn't do it. And you can only ask yourself why. They wouldn't do it because they knew they probably would struggle. The political price they pay would be a big one, because they made huge spending commitments, which they then blamed on us if they couldn't deliver. But if they'd made huge spending commitments and raised the tax themselves, just as every other government in the world has to, raise the money themselves, they'd have been in all sorts of bother. And they, as we're seeing at the moment, the reality is that the things are complicated and they hurt and they're difficult.
It's a totally.
And what's government always done that?
Yeah, I think it's a totally irresponsible way to run a government, to outsource the blame to other people rather than be responsible for the people that actually voted for you in the first place. But you're not only facing troubles in Wales, you got back to the cabinet table and Boris Johnson was in a bit of a pickle, to say the least, with a multiplicity of different scandals. When do you think was the point when people around the cabinet table were thinking, Boris Johnson's position is precarious, we need to do something about it?
There was talk. There was always talk. We're seeing it at the moment. There was always talk about, and as Partygate went from being a sort of one-off news story to what looked like something more serious, and there was a pattern to it, and the media smelt blood at this stage, and I suspect, Boris's responses were probably, came across as a little bit vague. If you knew Boris, you may not be quite surprised, but there was probably a little bit too much of nothing to see here, and as ever, I think that the greatest damage was done probably in the handling of the scandal rather than the scandal itself, and so. Everybody, I'm afraid, looks at their leader in politics through a very sort of selfish prism of, when is this person cease to be? When does this person cease to be of value to us in an electoral sense? And so long as Boris Johnson was an election winner, people would tolerate, a hell of a lot. But the moment it looked like Boris's magic touch as an election winner was starting to wear a bit thin, and our own members and our colleagues and the voters were beginning to think, hang on a minute, this joke is wearing a bit thin now. We can understand there might have been the odd mistake in COVID. We can understand that people were stretched to breaking point in professional, emotional terms. But this is we're looking like a laughing stock. That was when, and then the dam burst, as you know, in the run up to Boris's resignation, and everybody's just like, I don't want to be part of this anymore.
Yeah.
But we again, a bit like what I was saying about lockdown. I mean, nobody lurched into that decision without thought. I mean, I agonised about my own resignation for way too long, probably, and it's so much so that friends of mine were saying, what's the problem? Why are you letting this all damage your own reputation? My reputation was big damaged by my association with this, and people were saying, why are you still going out on the media defending all this stuff? It's ridiculous. And I think when your family and your friends start saying that, let alone your voters and your colleagues, you do have to ask yourself some quite searching questions. And number 10 is a complicated place, but at the time there was a feeling that the response from within the building was a bit tin-eared, and so it all came crashing down.
And before Johnson resigned, we obviously had that June 2022 no confidence vote. How did you vote in that?
I can't remember. I don't think I voted. I didn't vote against him in a confidence motion.
Okay.
I'd forgotten until you reminded me that we'd
just a tempting question, Simon.
No. And so I don't think I was in that place at that time. I mean, in the end, I was about the third member of the cabinet who resigned. But by then, the whole edifice was collapsing anyway. I think Boris resigned the day after I did. So it was only by then. It was just a matter of time. It was, as I said to Boris myself in the conversation we had when I resigned. If one or other of the incoming missiles was going to get him, and it might have been the 1922 committee and another confidence motion. It might have been the Standards Committee. Who might have triggered a recall motion and all the stuff which comes with that. One way or the other, the show was over. And which is why I was trying to urge him to sort of go maybe a few days earlier than he did. But these things are, there's lots of conflicting advice. He can't listen to everybody. But once, as I think Nadeem Zahawi said, once the herd stampedes, it's very difficult to stop it.
So Boris Johnson goes, and I believe you come out in support of Rishi Sunak for that leadership election. Why did you support him?
Well, I've always supported Rishi, and I had made it very clear early on that if ever the opportunity arose, I'd be very happy to get behind his leadership bid. And of course, that fizzled out in the Sunak versus Truss contest and sort of reignited later on in the year. But in Rishi, I always found something. We'd been on a select committee together and we'd known each other a bit, and we'd got some sort of mutual friends in the building and elsewhere. So I sort of knew a bit about him without being sort of close to him. And I think what I was, where I was at the time was, we'd had a bruising few months with the Boris Johnson saga and with COVID, and the party was bruised, the country was bruised, colleagues had been exhausted by this whole sort of psychodrama which had been going on. And in Rishi, I thought all the way through his premiership, and I think it to this day, we had somebody who was immensely hardworking, incredibly focused on detail. There was no paper, there was no submission, there was no spreadsheet that ever went into Rishi's office which he didn't read from start to finish and want to understand intimately what was in it and what was intended by it. He wasn't somebody who, he did it, put it this way, he did his homework on every subject, and even if that kept him up till 3 a.m. And so I thought there was somebody whose attention to detail was outstanding. And I also thought that, Rishi is a fundamentally very decent human being. He wants to do the right thing for the right reason. And people would occasionally, make sarcastic comments in the press about his personal wealth and his background.
Mm.
I think that's entirely missing the point. The fact that, in a sense, he was under no sort of career or financial obligation to do any of it, I thought spoke volumes about the sort of commitment he had to public service and to wanting to achieve good things for the country. And so I as I say, I maintain that, in a sense, he's almost a rare beast in politics, who's I said, just wants to do the right thing in the right order, in the right way, and get the right outcomes. For those reasons alone, I thought actually this is what the nation needs, the mandate, what the party needed, which is a period of sort of calm, able, hardworking, decent stability. Maybe we naively thought that would be rewarded in the ballot box at some future stage.
Yeah.
That turned out not to be the case. But I think he will. I think history will judge him. Well.
The challenge, obviously.
And looking back now, we're all thinking, maybe people who sort of decided they'd had nothing, Conservatives, and let's have a roll of the dice with Labour and see what happens. I think there are quite a lot of people, particularly people in the sort of SME world, aspirational businesses, people on middle incomes. I think there's quite a lot of people thinking, oh God, actually, maybe we were a bit rash in getting rid of Rishi. Maybe that wasn't necessarily the right reaction to the right problem at the time. But who knows? We'll see.
I'm certainly seeing the clips circling around social media about sort of Rishi was right, clips of the debates where he says, Labour are going to raise your taxes, is in their DNA, and then you get another clip of the budget, and it's like Rishi was right in the end. Obviously, the big problem that he had was that he had huge backing amongst your colleagues, the MPs, but then that didn't translate into the membership. Why do you think he had such huge support amongst the MPs but not amongst the grassroots members?
Well, I think there's a very interesting question. I mean, I think there was a time when the Conservative Party membership was a pretty accurate sort of mirror image of Conservative Party voters. But I'm not sure that's the case anymore. I think membership is one group of people who've got strong views about how the country should be governed. But I'm not absolutely sure. And 2019 is an example of this, where we won seats in areas we've never won seats before, and from people who'd never voted Conservative before. I'm not sure that is the case anymore. So I think there might be a bit of a disconnect. Maybe that's the case with all parties these days. So I'm not completely surprised that I think our members probably wanted something which was a bit more focused towards the sort of illegal migration type agenda, whereas our voters were a bit more centrist. Maybe that's an explanation. I may be wrong. I've not seen any data on that. But I don't think. But I do think there are, say, different, maybe different aspirations and different, marginally different political values from a much smaller membership, I mean, than we ever used to have. I mean, put it this way, we had, in my part of the world, 200 members of our association and an electorate of 65,000.
Yeah.
And so the 200 were choosing the Prime Minister, not the 65,000.
Yeah.
That's the way it's always been. I'm not necessarily advocating a change in the way in which we choose our leaders, but I just think there's some interesting research to be done in that area, and I think that I was surprised. I was surprised at the time, back in August of 22, when I did a sort of ring round of our own membership. I was surprised by the sort of division in the membership. I think it was roughly 60-40 in our case, 60 Truss, 40 Sunak. But I was also frustrated by the fact that somehow it had crept into the membership psyche that Rishi had been somehow responsible for the demise of Boris Johnson. That was, I mean, I never saw so much as a shred of evidence that supported that theory, ever. And so, it's frustrating. If that's what slightly influenced the first leadership election of that year, then that would be quite exasperating. But
so obviously,
it definitely, sorry, go on.
No, it's fine. Obviously, we get to the point where Liz Truss wins. I think the margin's something like 57-43. So what the polls were broadly predicting. But then we get to the point throughout Liz Truss's reign where obviously things go wrong, increasingly more serious as we go forward. What was your evolving view on that? And when was the point when you thought, Liz, you got to go, time's up?
Well, it's one of the many occasions where my judgment was entirely inaccurate, because I remember she got in. They instantly excommunicated anybody who'd been anything to do with the Sunak project, which I think was probably a mistake, but they that's the way they wanted to do it. That's fine. So I was out of my ear for the 49-day duration of the Truss premiership, and I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine who's sort of interested in politics. Said, "Oh, it'll never last, and that should be gone by Christmas." And I remember saying to him, a friend of mine, "No, you don't understand. You don't understand. Once you're in number 10, your roots grow very quickly, and it's amazing how long you can hang on in there, and how reluctant everybody will be to sort of to allow themselves to be dragged out. So this, she's in now. We got to make the best of it, and blah blah blah." Anyway, I was completely astonished by the speed and the sort of the way in which it all came apart quite so quickly. And I think the lesson that I derived from that was, and it's an important leadership lesson, this, is you can have all the bright ideas in the world, you can be the brainiest person in the room, but it all counts for nothing unless you can carry people with you. And what Liz failed to do was carry people with her. And there are people who since said, well, actually, don't you think she was sort of right about some stuff? Sort of doesn't matter. She probably was right about some stuff, I don't know. But the fact is she wasn't able to take, the bond markets, she wasn't able to take her colleagues, and she wasn't able to take the media, and she wasn't ultimately able to take the country with her on that particular the journey that she'd set herself. Now, she describes that as, she was too bold and she went too far, too fast. That may be true. But history, the only way in which history records all of this is that 49 days after she went in, and bear in mind, 14 days of that was a period of national mourning for the death of the Queen. So the days in which she was governing was 49 less 14. Was barely a month before, not only one wheel came off, all four wheels came off, as spectacularly as we can all remember. And so I just think it is an important lesson for leaders. You can't make promises you can't keep. You have to explain what you're trying to do and how you're trying to do it and why you're trying to do it in a really clear and articulate and measured way. And you can only go as far or as fast as your stakeholders, shareholders, voters are prepared to let you go. And it was a very, very pitiless. And of course, the wider problem is that in the space of about 4 months, the two things that the two most crucial voting criteria that the nation judges us on was integrity and economic competence. Yeah. And in the space of 3 months, we basically damaged our reputation for integrity with never-ending saga that was Partygate, and then completely torpedoed our reputation for economic competence when the mini budget, the bond market crash, and Christ knows what else. And so those were the two things which kept us in contention and kept us in the public with a degree of public sympathy and support. And so in the space of 3 months, we managed to actually terminally damage, well, maybe not terminally, but we managed to do an enormous amount of damage to both of those things. So, when Rishi went over, I think we went 20 points behind in the opinion polls in the second week of Liz Truss's premiership. And what was interesting is that figure never really changed throughout the whole of Rishi's premiership. It never really went up or down by any significant amount, which just tells me one important thing, which is the nation had reached its view about us much earlier than we think. And that people had just decided it was somebody else's turn come the election, whenever that was going to be. And that's why we started 20 points behind, and well, actually we finished 14 points behind. But the polls were saying 20 points right up until the final moment. And there was nothing we could do, well or badly, that really altered that by any significant amount.
The thing about the Liz Truss mini-budget is how long-lasting it is. I mean, earlier today when I was watching Prime Minister's Questions, Keir Starmer is still talking about it. He's still blaming Kemi Badenoch, who had precisely zero involvement over that, about the decisions that were made there. And it keeps going and going and going. And like you said with Mark Drakeford, it gives him the opportunity to abdicate his responsibility that he has to the people that he serves and the Chancellor, the people that she serves as well. It means that economic policy is essentially Liz Truss's fault, despite her not being in office for 3 years.
Yeah, and I do think I think it's a lazy approach to all of this. And I do think members of the public, it feels to me like people hate this sort of blame shifting game. I think there were things we did well, there were things we did badly. There were and we're probably guilty of having blamed Labour when we went in, clearing up the mess. George Osborne's expression, I think, back in 2010. So we're all a bit guilty of that. But I think there's a moment where you have to say, okay, well, look, it's now somebody, it's now our responsibility. We are actually in, sorry, a bit of noise on my left. We're now responsible. We are in government. Therefore, the buck stops with us. You can't keep talking about that. And as somebody pointed out the other day, quite a lot of the economic challenges facing Rachel Reeves are challenges which actually have emerged since July of last year, since they assumed office. They can't blame. I can't remember what those are, by the way, but you can't blame the Conservative government for literally everything that is remotely difficult, which ends up on the plate of the Chancellor. That is just, I think the public will see straight through that and think of just being wet, and you need to get a grip and you need to take responsibility. You're in charge. Your job is to rectify these problems and also maintain public confidence rather than just say, oh, it's not too difficult because the nasty Tories left us a horrible legacy. Nobody's interested in that. What they're interested in is, okay, we've got this problem. This is going to be difficult. This is what we're going to do. We think we can do it in a relatively empathetic and sort of timely way. And it'll be a bit bumpy, but the final outcome will be worth it. A bit of, just a little bit of positivity in that. And it's extraordinary. It's quite extraordinary. I mean, one of the things which strikes me about the current government appears to be completely almost in a sort of indignant rage that anybody should ever criticise it. I genuinely think that they thought all they needed to do was not be the Tories, and everybody would owe them 10 years worth of uninterrupted love and respect. And I think they find it quite difficult that actually, no, funny enough, they're going to look at you, the Labour government, and just same way they look at us, which is through a pretty critical and sceptical telescope, and expect results. And if you don't produce results, you get exactly the same treatment as we did.
And the thing that the Labour Party conveniently leave out is the fact that they were advocating for longer lockdowns and more spending for the government to get more involved during COVID, which would have pushed up inflation and wrecked the public finances even more. But obviously, we can't talk about that bit.
Well, I know. I also voted against pretty well every measure we came up with in terms of illegal migration. They enthusiastically voted down or tried to, and now are sort of expecting us to support them doing largely what was actually a Conservative policy. I mean, you can understand why there's a sense of sort of scepticism in voters these days when this is how it gets. This is how it gets portrayed.
I believe the first name on one of these anti-deportation flight letters was the Home Secretary a few years ago, so the irony keeps going forward. I believe on the 24th of October, after Liz Truss goes and the Conservative Party's sort of opinion poll ratings don't really recover, you wrote, obviously, one of your diary entries about being appointed or being asked by Rishi Sunak to be Chief Whip. Now, my impression, Simon, you can interrupt if I get any of this wrong, is that the Chief Whip is quite an imposing, dominant figure that goes around and essentially says, you must vote this way, you've got a 3-line whip, and trying to enforce the rules. Is that true? And why do you think you got picked for the role?
Well, I think it's true, the sort of television dramatisation of the role of, on the rare occasion that whips ever feature in TV stuff, is the impression that's given. And I think so there's some historical accuracy there. I think the thing which slightly which Rishi wanted to achieve, and I think we did achieve actually, is to be able to run his government on a more professional basis, and that if what was coming out of number 10 and out of Rishi's own mouth was sensible and measured and well considered and well researched, then we would the role of the whips was in a sense made easier, because we were simply asking people to behave in a similarly responsible way, and there was no doubt at all that use that old expression, a sort of fish stings from the head. If we got things right at the top, and if the tone as well as content was reasonable, then it was a great deal harder for people just to be bloody minded and to try and inconvenience government. Now, actually what was interesting amongst all of the chaos and confusion and the pressures and the noise and the, all that kind of stuff, we only ever lost one vote. Despite everything we tried, and the vote we lost was an entirely self-inflicted injury. It was on Johnson's amendment on the question of infected blood, the compensation for infected blood, where actually the government agreed with what Diana was attempting to do, but we had some difficulties in just getting the Treasury in the right place. And by the time we got the Treasury in the right place, it was a bit late, and we lost by 4 votes. But so it was very much my intention, supported by Rishi, to run a whip's office, which was it was based more on a professional approach than a process of persuasion rather than a process of force. And we thought, and indeed, actually, we were. I would, I think this was borne out. We didn't threaten people with sanctions. There were moments when we got very close to that. But Rishi never wanted to make martyrs, by the way. There were noises of, occasionally going on social media criticising him. There were, talk of leadership contests, all that. And, the old days, people would have been taken in and had the whip withdrawn and all sorts of sort of public, humiliation. That was never his style, nor was it mine, because all that would have done is make martyrs of people. And also, we were living in a world where there was another right of centre option for people, Lee Anderson being one who took it, to defect to reform. In the old days, you didn't have that. They either defected to Labour or they didn't defect. And that's, so people felt that they could remain on the right in politics. And so there was, and we didn't want to, humour people with that. I remember when, once a week, Andrea Jenkins would tweet some sort of unbelievably rude and hostile comment about Rishi. And people would come to me and say, "It's a bloody outrage. We should we should remove the whip. We should do this." But actually, Rishi's view was, no. We've got a country to run here. Probably the one thing Andrea does want is to be sort of spectacularly thrown out, so she can sort of defect or reform in a blaze of glory, and sort of do something. So we just took the notions of it, really. And our job was to try and get the government's business done, and that's what we did. Did we deploy, clever techniques in order to get our majority? Yeah, but they weren't based on force or threats. They were based on a rather, I think, more nuanced form of persuasion. And it's on that count alone, just on did we get our vote through, it turned out to be quite successful.
I don't think we need to worry about Andrea Jenkins. She's getting all the attention she needs after seeing our insomniac at Reform Conference, so no need to worry about her whatsoever.
I did watch that and think, because you do look back and think, God, maybe I misjudged these people. Maybe they were really brilliant and we just missed it. And then I saw that and I thought, actually,
got it right.
Yeah.
But I think during your time as Chief Whip, you had some of the most extraordinary stories and interactions with colleagues. I mean, you have one here, I believe, on the 24th of November, where you described one of your colleagues calling you at 2:45 and telling you that he was stuck in a brothel and had run out of money. Now, I've never received a call like that, Simon. I really hope I don't throughout the entirety of my life. But was this the weirdest case you've ever dealt with as Chief Whip, or was there a stranger one?
I mean, I would love to. I mean, listen, it's the exception, not the rule. Don't get me wrong. Most people, and I really do mean this when I say it, most people were thoroughly decent, thoroughly professional, thoroughly committed to doing the best possible job that they could. And actually, that description spills over into other parties as well. And so I didn't think people came into politics in order to be mischief makers or pursue some weird fetish that they might. That was never the case. What used to happen when people would encounter some really difficult periods of their lives, and some people would be better equipped at dealing with that than others. And I did feel, and I still feel, that I'm not sure that all of the available sort of mentoring and support for colleagues is quite in the right place. It's better than it used to be, but I still think we could do better in helping colleagues prepare for and work in a high-pressure environment, either as a backbencher or indeed as a minister, and therefore minimise the chance of the wheels falling off. And then if the wheels do fall off, having a better support system to try to make sure we help them through that. The particular case you talk about, I mean, listen to where every few weeks, sometimes felt like more than that, we would get wind of some unbelievably strange sort of you couldn't make it up type story. And I've tried in the book not to make it too, I don't want to make it sound like we all think that was all a big, massive, big laugh. I mean, it was more of a jaw-dropping moment than a moment of humour. In the end, actually, those kind of things were rather mystifying. And even though we resolved that particular problem, and by the way, the anonymity of the individual is no longer an MP, but anonymity of that person is protected for good reason. But the circumstances I described is because, what the hell's, that sort of shouldn't happen. And there were security implications, and something had gone wrong. And what I'm not sure we completely get yet is why things like that happen. Do they happen in every workplace in the land? Is it just politics where they bubble to the surface? But it didn't happen too often. But that was not an isolated case. There were Monday mornings always used to be a bit of the meetings I used to have with some of my team on a Monday morning would throw up some interesting weekend stuff, and some of it was funny, some of it was sad, some of it was worrying. All of it needed some kind of reaction. Bear in mind, and it's a point I do make in the book, the Whip's office is made up of a bunch of MPs. We're not grief counsellors, we're not financial advisors, we're not lawyers. There's an awful lot of things we're not, and yet there's an awful lot of things in those kind of areas where we were expected to opine and to advise and to help. And it used to worry me, and it still worries me, that we are not necessarily the right people to do that. The parliamentary systems are miles better. The sort of support mechanisms are miles better than they used to be. And current speaker's done a lot in that respect. But still, the first question that the press always ask when something goes wrong is, when did the Whips know? What did the Whips know? When did they know it? Does the Prime Minister know? Did the Whips tell Number 10? So, we were always working also against this backdrop of the fact that people wanted to do us over. And nothing the press enjoyed more was to be able to say, well, the Whips knew but did nothing about whatever it was. And so there was always a clock ticking in the background. You get wind of something like this, you think, oh Christ, right, what is the correct action? What is it? Have we signposted somebody who might have been the victim of an assault of some kind? Have we signposted them to the right parliamentary resources, and indeed the police if it warranted it? Have we made sure that everybody has got the necessary support that they need? Have we made sure that where notifications of where the Speaker's office might have been needed to opine on, for example, something like whether somebody should be allowed onto the parliamentary estate or not? They might have been arrested for something but not charged. Does that mean they have their pass withdrawn? And if not, why not? All of these things had to be done against us in a very, very accelerated timetable, because there was bound to be media interest in what was going on, and we needed to get it right. And we needed to make sure that if somebody raised a question, Prime Minister's question, during a press conference that the PM was hosting, we need to make sure that everything was in place so he could give a coherent answer. And so he needs to know everything that, in a sense, he needs to know. those, as I say, we were a bunch of backbenchers, who had been formed into a team and into a ministerial team in the Whip's office. So, and I don't think a single one of us had ever had a day's training in any one of those areas. So, there is a serious side to this. Thank God, in my view, God, for some very good people, advisors, special advisors, civil servants, and indeed the parliamentary sort of health and well-being and support mechanisms. Because without them, I think a lot of people would have been quite exposed. And that's relatively recent. That's all relatively recent. That we've been able to defer to proper, if you like, fully trained and qualified professionals on the parliamentary estate when some of these things came our way.
One of the things you illustrate in the book is the constant requests from your colleagues to get on the honours list. And as I'm reading this, I can almost feel through the page your frustration at people constantly going to you and say, please put me on the honours list. How difficult was that for you to judge? And do you think that indicates a wider problem with MPs that just want to get on the honours list?
I think it was, it was a weird thing, really. And, here am I talking shit from the House of Lords, so I mean, to a degree of irony is not lost on me. I think as we got closer to the inevitability of an election in 2024, everybody knew that this was going to be election year. And for a lot of people, they knew that they were underwater already, and the polls were not looking kindly on them, and that for a lot of people this was going to be the end of their political career. They may not have been in government, or may not have may have been in government, not got back in, and so to be honest, they were keen not to leave empty-handed, and often wanted something to which, as they often used to describe to me, was as much for their family and their friends as it was for them, and I sort of think that was partially true. Rishi had a very firm view about the honour system generally, which was that he didn't want it seen as a sort of pick and mix sort of treat stall. This was the honour system was to be for people who had done more than simply the job for which they were paid. So just being an MP wasn't necessarily enough. But if you'd been an MP who'd fronted up a campaign or done something really great or got some very important law passed, done an unbelievably great job, with some community or other, then that I did think set you apart, and that would get you on a list. The list was quite short. People always used to think we could, you can make, a dozen knighthood or hand out a dozen knighthoods. We were political knighthoods were, I think, 4 a year or something like that. There weren't very many. Yeah. Yes, you could slip a few in by other routes, but by and large, the system was quite tight, and it did. It was quite comical, really. The closer we got to election, the greater the frequency of which people used to, drop increasingly unsubtle hints about their honours ambitions. We were, I tried to be straight with everybody and say, look, the only thing I can commit to is I can add your name to an increasingly long list, and at some stage, the PM and others will have a look at this list and will be able to make a judgment. And that's what we did, and it was quite painful at times. I think I said somewhere, we nearly called the book about my knighthood, because it became sort of almost a daily occurrence that somebody would lean around the door in my office and say, about my knighthood. And some people did that with good reason, but there were others I thought, well, good luck to you. That was an optimistic. You deserve something for your optimism and your barefaced cheek. Especially ones who did it. A lot of people did it with style and panache. Yeah. But it was still a bit of a long shot. I wish we could have done more, but you can't. These are very, very. They come in very limited supply. These things, but it was and I think every party, by the way, every party comes up against the same thing. You're at the end of your term in office. Lots of people, and Labour, by the way, Labour, I think, will have a much bigger problem than us, partly because more of them.
Yeah.
And so, they've got people who probably will never make it into government, who are almost bound to lose after one term, just natural wastage. There certainly will be people at the end of this 3, 4, 5-year term who won't be in government, never been in government, probably going to be voted out. And they'll be queuing up outside the Chief Whip's office saying, "Is there anything in the, anything in the sweetie jar left?" And if it's still Johnny Reynolds, he'll be giving the same answers I gave, which is, "Well, we can put you down on a list, but no promises."
One of your diary entries, I believe, on the 20th of February, you said about a certain individual, and you know who this is, that she, and I quote, "lives in a permanent state of outrage." Now, that woman obviously is the current leader of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch. Do you still hold that viewpoint about her?
Well, I don't. I think, in fairness, and I think in the context of that is, I actually think living in a state of outrage as a politician is a good thing, not a bad thing. And it's not intended to be, but maybe as critical as it sounds. Margaret Thatcher used to say that she had to have a fight with somebody every day. And if you want stuff done in politics, you've got to be aggressive, and you've got to be forthright, and yes, you've got to be angry. And even though there are those who being angry is potentially quite a sort of exhausting lifestyle. It wasn't intended actually to be as rude about Kemi as I thought. She is somebody who wanted, didn't shy away from making her ambitions and her demands in terms of running her department. I said that not about jobs. That's not about give me a job. This was about what the maximum she could achieve in her time in one department or another. So I think to succeed as a leader of a party, and to succeed as a leader of a party in opposition, and to be heard above the noise, and that's the big challenge at the moment, is being heard above a lot of noise out there. The Conservatives still on the back of a crushing election defeat last year. It's difficult to get heard and difficult to get listened to. And I think being, not taking no for an answer, is a strength, not a weakness. So it shouldn't be portrayed as a reason, anything other than positive.
How do you think she's doing as leader?
Well, I was talking to a colleague of hers yesterday, who shall be nameless, and we were both agreeing. This was a guy who was, by the way, not. I don't think voted for. I think voted for Jenny. And we were both agreeing that actually, I think she's done well to avoid the temptation to just try and be a sort of, reform in another uniform type thing. And I think that's been sensible. And I think as it seems to me at any rate, the market is crowded in all of the big policy areas. The market is crowded. The one bit of the market which I think is still up for grabs, and which I think she and Mel Stride are doing quite well, is around, sound money and about sensibly. It's about restoring our reputation for economic competence and making sensible and realistic noises about the economy, rather than all of the sort of, blaming a former government in the case of Rachel Reeves, or promising the earth in the case of reform or whatever. And I think that although it be a sort of tortoise and hare moment a bit, but I think re-establishing our economic credentials, restoring our reputation for sensible tax regimes, sensible economics, nothing flashy, not over-promising, I think that stands as good a chance as anybody and anything of getting us back into public contention. And to that end, I think I think she's doing better than a lot of people thought that she would do. And by the way, Prime Minister's questions is anything to go by, and it should be. I mean, people need to be reminded that back when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, William Hague, as leader of the Conservative Party, then used to routinely thrash him every week. Every week, get an absolute pounding. It made zero difference to anybody, but what it did make a difference to was the morale of the backbenchers and the sort of attitude of the party members. The public, hardly any members of the public watch Prime Minister's questions, so it's sort of largely irrelevant from a public perception point of view. But from a point of view of the morale of your own people, it's really important. And there's no doubt at all that she's got into a groove and into a stride. I didn't see today's version, but up till now, she's got into a groove, which is, I think it is making it. I think Starmer probably is dreading Wednesdays now. He was probably looking forward to them a year ago, but I think he's probably, spending more time and more effort on prepping than he ever thought he'd have to. And fair play to him.
Yeah, I think the willingness of the backbenchers to heckle Starmer is evident as the days go by. We saw last week, obviously, when he was talking about the United team, supposedly, the Wes Streeting leadership rumours, and the Conservative backbenchers, from my perspective, looked like they were absolutely loving that session, which I suppose from Kemi's perspective was great to see.
I say from a party management point of view, that's really, really important. I mean, we won't expect necessarily in big changes in opinion polls, but, I've been... now everybody I've ever met has always told me that your first couple of years in opposition are an absolute nightmare because, it's just, you're still carrying the scars of the past. Nobody's really interested in what you have to say. And so the way in which you say it is important. And I think credit where it's due. I think this is probably, I know we're short of, it's not a big team, but I think it's in better sort of match condition than a lot of people anticipated.
So just to go back to the book, Sunak calls that election in May. We're all expecting that will be in November time. Obviously, his maximum, I believe, was January the year after. Were the cabinet informed about that? Because I'm a little bit confused on that. And do you think that was the right decision in the end?
I think people sort of willfully sort of ignore a couple of important things here. One of which is there were probably only 3 months of the year that was ever going to be July, October or November. And the reason I say that is that in order to, don't forget there were important mayoral elections in May. And at a very, very early stage, we all agreed that we didn't want the mayoral elections to be interfered with by a general election. That Andy Street and Ben Hagson's best chances of success were to fight an unencumbered election based on their own reputations, their own brand, and their own achievements. So if anything, if we'd suddenly announced an election, it would have been, those mayorals would have become a sort of proxy for the general, and we didn't want to do that. Point one. Point two was that Rishi had said fairly early on, working hypothesis, second half of the year. So that ruled out everything up until the end of June. So the clock could only start ticking in July. Now, we weren't going to do August because it's a holiday month and nobody would be here. And likewise, in a sense, September for the same reason as you don't do August. So that brought October, November into play. Yep, they were possible. And then, of course, January. But I don't think anybody ever really was thinking of going to the bitter end a la John Major in 97 because you rule out any flexibility you've got. I think the third thing was, I think there was this probably misplaced optimism around things can only get better. We were worried about a number of things. We were worried about prison places, which were close to overflowing by then. We were worried about fiscal headroom, use an expression, in that we had huge commitments over things like victims of infected blood, post office horizon compensation, good things which we were all very happy to do, but it did remove Jeremy Hunt's ability to suddenly have a sort of, eye-catching pre-election giveaway. We were worried that even though we'd passed the Rwanda legislation, that getting a plane off the ground and with all of the, positive effects that we'd hoped to attach to that was, wasn't by any means certain. And we were worried that botched attempt to get a plane of another, last minute stoppage on the runway would have been hugely damaging to us. We were worried that by then there were probably 3 people muttering about leadership bids, and even though we didn't think any of them were very well advanced, we thought there was a chance that almost by accident you fall into them, etc., etc. So we thought the next few months were pretty rocky. Other people thought it was suddenly all be brilliant, and we'd have a giveaway budget in September, big election promises, blah blah. But anyway, and the other thing was that it didn't matter what we were doing. As I said earlier, we seemed to be this sort of polling flat line, minus doing 20 points by nothing we did budged it. We'd done 2 national insurance cuts, I think, by then. It didn't have any impact at all. Nothing was changing anything. And so there was a feeling that we needed to sort of almost, force everybody's hand in a way, force everybody into having to make a decision rather than, having not to. And, I think we knew in our heart of hearts that this was never going to be easy. And we just didn't think necessarily waiting for another 2 or 3 months would make it any easier. And I don't know, nobody would be able to ever know whether if we'd gone in October, it might have been better. It could have been worse. Imagine a scenario where, we'd had to release, 10,000, bad guys into the community through prison places, or had a prison officer strike, or, we'd had a failed attempt to, the Rwanda policy had been publicly humiliated with a failure to get a plane off, where, we'd had an autumn statement or budget which hadn't really changed the dial much. One of the, Rishi had to contest a vote of no confidence. All of these things were playing on our minds, and we will never know what difference, if any, they made. I've come to the view, I don't think any of it made a difference. I think the public had decided it was, to say, somebody else's, turn at the wheel, and it wasn't going to be us. We'd exhausted all of the available goodwill by then, and so we were out. Would we have lost by more or less? I don't think it's as clear cut as some people think.
One of the narratives that was certainly going around the media at the time was the reason why Rishi Sunak called the election was to prevent Nigel Farage from coming back into politics. But obviously, we know how that went. Was that true?
I mean, I don't remember that being a sort of, comment which was sort of, if you like, played a significant part in the choice of election date. I think you could argue it both ways. You could argue that if we'd waited till September, October, he might have been in America doing other things. On the other hand, if we hadn't gone in July, that was tantamount to saying to the nation, we're going in October. So we'd essentially given Reform and Nigel Farage, 2 to 3 months notice of when the election was actually going to be.
Yeah.
So he had even more time to sort himself out and sort of organise the party. So I think the idea that the whole election choice was based on what Nigel's holiday plans were, or whatever it might have been, I think that's probably a bit of an exaggeration. I think but were we thinking about it? I mean, I wasn't terribly central to all of it, I hasten to add, but the bits I was familiar with, it was, occasionally came up in the sort of conversations around the edge, but it wasn't one of the sort of top 6 reasons for going for the early date rather than the later date.
We've been touching on the national campaign here, but let's focus on your own campaign in your constituency of Carmarthen West and South Pembrokeshire. How did that go?
Well, I'd been abolished by then.
Oh, okay. So it was a new constituency.
Well, sort of. I'd been semi-abolished. My old seat, Carmarthen West and South Pembrokeshire, had ceased to be, and so we had a new arrangement. So it had gone back to the old county of Pembrokeshire, which was sort of half me and half Stephen Crabb, now held by Labour, and the county of Carmarthenshire, which was further to the east, which was a sort of essentially a 3-way marginal Labour Conservative Clyde Cymru, and various other odd sorts, I seem to remember. So we were in very unknown territory. I'd opted for the Carmarthenshire seat rather than the Pembrokeshire seat because, Stephen and I had both, Stephen been there since 2005, me since 2010. So, we didn't want to, we were good friends. We didn't want to have a battle over that. I think we both knew that writing was on anyway. I was very happy to have stood down in 2024, but it was important from the point of view of the cabinet and what Rishi was attempting to achieve that we all fought our seats as hard as we could. So I was happy to do that, but my expectation, I think, luckily, my expectation was matched by reality, or reality matched my expectation, and we started in third place and we finished in third place. So no surprises there. Actually, I thought we did quite well, but yeah. So it was a funny campaign because it was voters were not in any sense aggressive or unpleasant, but you could tell that they were sort of looking over your shoulder a bit, and that there had been a sort of collective decision had been taken subconsciously. You should have. There was no moment in the election campaign when I thought, we may be okay here. There was a moment when I thought coming second wasn't impossible, but there was never a moment when I thought, the polls are wrong. I never felt quite like that.
I mean, who do you think is most responsible for losing your seat? Do you think it is you, or one of the Conservative Party leaders, or do you think it was the good opposition that you faced?
No, I'm a believer in the political cycle. I think 14 and a half years is a long time. I don't think any party in history has ever won a fifth term. Which is what we were attempting to do. And I think society has a way, I often quote, my children in this instance who are in their early 20s and, had no recollection of life under any other party than ours, even being alive, but they were very young at the time. And so, some of the sort of scare stories about, you don't want to go back to Labour, are meaningless to their generation. They don't know what we're talking about. So I think that the only thing you can rely on in politics is the fact that the cycle comes to an end. You can't tell when, but it's definitely not if. And I felt it was just like that, really. I think people just thought, no, okay, thanks very much. You've done your best. You've had your good moments. You've had your bad moments. But we want to try something else off the menu now. Thanks very much. And so I don't blame. So I think the candidates have a depressingly small impact on election outcomes. And the established theory is that we're worth about 2,000 votes. On the basis of our own incumbency and our own profile. I think that's probably about right. I think the theory that somehow everybody knows their candidate and votes accordingly is massively exaggerated. I think that the leaders, yes, I think people do vote for, Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak or whoever it might be at the time. I think that's definitely the case. But I think, as I say, when it comes to the end of, I don't think there's much Rishi could have done, which would have made any difference, because I think, as I say, we were at the end of the cycle. So I don't think it's a case of, I don't think it's a case of blaming anybody. Or in my case, it's a plain come receipt, and I don't think many people, I think they got in on about 12,000 votes in a constituency which has got 75,000 votes available. So in a strange quirk of our I think less than a fifth of my new constituency voted for the person who's now their MP.
Yeah.
You know,
Not
I'm making a case for proportional representation here,
well,
but
there you go.
low turnout. We were terribly low. Yeah, we were down to 59%. Normally it's 75%.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of people who stayed at home this time. That made a big difference.
Absolutely.
Big difference. So apathy may have been a much bigger influence than we realise.
And obviously that concludes your book, but this can be an exclusive for us, Simon. Are you writing another diary book from your time in the House of Lords that I can expect?
No.
Oh,
I mean, definitely not. I mean, by the way, this exercise is, it doesn't get universally. Not everybody likes the idea. I think I'd rather flippantly say that that the only people it offends more than those who were in it are those who were not in it, and there's a bit of that. But no, I mean, this was, for me, that period, December 19 to July 24, and what everybody involved in the process of trying to keep the ship afloat had to endure and encounter and resolve and manage on a daily basis. I think it is an important story to tell, because I think people's external perceptions of what life is like in Number 10 or what life is like in government during a pandemic or a war are not often matched by reality. The reality is that you've got a bunch of people on the inside of Number 10, on the inside of government, who are largely similar to everybody on the outside. It's just, people stretched to the absolute limit, doing their absolute best to get the right outcomes, and not always succeeding in that endeavour. But as I say, generally speaking, it's decent people trying to do the right thing for the right reason, and usually falling foul of all of the, human weaknesses which, every workplace in the land suffers from time to time. So, and to try, I was trying to also, with a bit of mischievous humour as well, try to indicate that if you're the Prime Minister, bloody hell, it's a hard job. It is absolutely. I mean, that's hence the title of the book, Ungovernable. Is it was almost, I should have almost put a question mark after that, because you do come to the conclusion that can anybody succeed in politics at the moment? And one of my big fears, I fear another change of government to, let's say, hypothetically a reform government. It's not my idea of the right outcome necessarily. And one of the reasons I think that is because they're making promises which can't possibly be kept either. And if we had a third government on the clock, which in the eyes of the public failed to deliver on a few simple pledges that it made, then I do fear for people's confidence in politics generally, and divisions in society, and I think all of that could get a lot worse, and that does worry me. And so it's important that we give our prime ministers, in our case a Conservative prime minister, the greatest opportunity to succeed. And we make it bloody difficult for people. Ourselves, we make it difficult for people, and guess what? Starmer comes in, this great, the great new hope for Labour. Most prime ministers in history get a couple of years to find their feet and to succeed or fail. He was sort of written off within a couple of months.
Yeah.
You can't carry on running a country like that. We can't keep changing prime ministers. We can't keep just getting bored of our toys every 5 minutes. Oh, well, he's no good. Let's try another one. Oh, he's no good either. Let's try another one. Let's try her. Let's see what she's like. Oh, she's rubbish as well. Let's try another one. You can't do that. And that's not grown up. So we have to give these people a bit of a break and allow them to govern in the long term, not govern till next Saturday. This is the pressure they're applying.
During all those leadership elections, you had all those different candidates. Obviously, you came out in support of Rishi Sunak. Did you ever think, God, these people are terrible, I'll give it a go?
I think probably that there isn't a politician alive who hasn't at some stage, probably after a long evening in the pub, thought, bloody hell, I could do this, I could do this. And the sensible ones, after about 15 seconds, conclude that they've had one too many.
Time to go home,
And to answer your question is, I mean, one of the few advantages of being, one of the older people in I think I was the oldest person around the cabinet table, which is a weird thing at age 60 as I was at the time. You don't feel old, but you look around the table and think, actually, I am literally the oldest person here. I think Alistair Jack maybe a month older or a month younger than me, I can't remember. And so you're a bit of and there are occasions, there are occasions when you think, oh God, I could do this. But if you've got half a brain cell, you soon conclude that actually you couldn't. And I'm watching, in my case, I saw sort of Rishi Sunak up close, and I saw a bit of Boris up close. These people were bloody hard. And the interesting thing for me is that every 15 minutes of every day, you were required to make a decision which has profound consequences. Nobody else, in the end, it is down to you. And all the advice, you have 15 civil servants and advisors around the table, but you put your signature on a piece of paper, and you are answerable for that. You are accountable for that, and you cannot make mistakes. People do, and in the old days, there was a bit of tolerance. Now, there is no tolerance. And it's not just, for most of us, having to make one decision like that in our professional lives would probably be a bit stressful. We are expecting our political leaders to do it relentlessly every single day. And, these people are working 16, 17, 18 hours a day. And they're under unbelievable scrutiny from every possible angle. Even in their sort of, the downtime, the rare bit of downtime they might get at spend a bit of time with their kids, whatever it might be. It is absolutely relentless pressure of a sort. And so anybody who ever has a sort of one of these wild thoughts about, maybe I can see myself in that role, give your head a wobble, because actually I suspect there are very few people on this earth who are actually emotionally and professionally and physically equipped to do this stuff, and so everybody has probably a moment, and then the sensible ones fall away quite quickly, and hopefully you're left with the really good ones. And the system works, filters out the bad ones. Doesn't always work, as we know, but more often than not.
You were in the Commons obviously for 14 years during that Conservative time in government, or Conservative-led time in government. Who was the best Prime Minister you served?
Oh, I mean, it's a bit. I didn't serve Liz Truss, so we can rely.
As a Conservative MP.
I went in under David Cameron. I'm going to give you a very, very sort of prevaricative answer on this, because I'm not sure it's a case of sort of ranking them 1 to 4, 1 to 5. But I thought that, for me, David Cameron was in a sense a sort of perfect version of what I felt that a Prime Minister at the time should be, because he is a centrist. He's a one nation Tory like me. I thought he had presence and panache, and I thought he had good communication skills, and I think that he came across as prime ministerial, and I admired David Knight, but his politics sat comfortably with me. I think Theresa, Theresa was she was a fantastically competent and decent person, and I think everybody was surprised and disappointed that it didn't sort of quite work in the way that we all thought that it could, and she was done over really by that weird 2017 election, and I think sort of probably a much more able person than perhaps was portrayed at the time, and maybe lacked a little bit of sort of David's flair, but didn't, but was, if we look for strong, her expression, strong and stable competence, she had and does have it in spade loads. Who do we have next? Who do we go with? Boris next, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, Boris, the sort of the most standout in terms of strength of personality. We knew with Boris, even if you didn't really like him, we knew that he could sort of sweep up votes from corners of the country that we weren't normally used to having them, and he had this sort of strange celebrity appeal. So you can tell where I'm going here. I'm going sort of, is there a way we could have had a sort of hybrid version of all of these people? David's politics, Theresa's sort of competence, Boris's panache. And then where did we go? We went from Boris to Liz. Well,
did you just leave that one?
That was it. No, I wasn't concentrating on that. And obviously the one I was closest to in every possible way was Rishi, because I did think that he was the hybrid version of the above. I did think he had all of those qualities, and he was what was. And so rather than rank them 1 to 5, because I think they were all for their time, and we needed, after Theresa, we needed a sort of, a popular celebrity in order to sort of get the votes back, and after Boris, we needed somebody of Rishi's integrity and competence to steady the economic ship, and restore faith in us as a party of government. I was obviously much closer to Rishi than I was the others. I'd been in the building and during the other premierships in quite the way I was with his, and I maybe take a different view, but by and large, you don't get to be Prime Minister without having a bit of X factor. Whatever. It's not always good, but you've got to have something which most people don't have.
So I'm not going to get a clear-cut 1 to 5 there, am I, Simon?
Say that again.
I'm not going to get a clear-cut 1 or 5 there.
No, and I do think actually, even if we weren't doing this, if you like, in public forum, I think I'd struggle with that, because they're different people and different times and different quotes. David had to manage a coalition. He had to have 16 Lib Dems. He had to have Deputy Prime Minister was a Lib Dem, and managing that coalition. I remember at the time thinking that coalition period was going to be the most sort of tumultuous period of our political lives ever. I mean, it's turned out to be amongst the most sort of uneventful. And it went unbelievably smoothly, and everybody behaved unbelievably well. And Nick Clegg turned out to be a rather public-spirited, professional deputy PM. But that required. I don't think a coalition with the Lib Dems would have been Boris's strong point, for example, or Liz's strong point. But David was able to. And nobody thought he'd do it. Everybody thought it would all fall over. But it didn't. He was absolutely the right player for those conditions. And so it's about picking the right bowler for the right pitch conditions. And I think, so that's why I don't want to rank them 1 to 5, because I thought David was a sort of 5 out of 5 at his, 1 out of 5, whatever you want to do, 5 out of 10 out of 10 at his particular moment in history. And I think Rishi was in his. But I would hesitate to say which was, I don't want to say. I think ranking them is too easy and too lazy.
When I asked your colleague,
Rishi was the one. I think history will reflect well.
And when I asked your colleague Sir Graham Brady that question, he said David Cameron number 1 and Liz Truss number 5. So I don't know if you share that sentiment. It seems like a perfectly reasonable answer. Everyone's going to put.
I think I'll compromise. I'll go for. I'll agree with. Graham on the number 5.
On number 5, okay. Okay, but no number 1.
We can probably agree on that. And I think I'd probably put, for me, I'd probably put Rishi 1 if you forced me to do that.
Okay.
But I hate doing it because I think it's probably rather unfair some of the others who were operating in different conditions.
I very much doubt any of the Prime Ministers are watching this podcast, so nothing to fear, Simon. It's absolutely flown by this time. I really appreciate you coming on, but
we got there in the end. Yeah.
Yes, our traditional concluding question is always about hospitality. We want to boost hospitality all across this country. We know it's had a difficult time since Rachel Reeves's budget, losing about 90,000 jobs. So we'd really appreciate if you could share some of the best hospitality venues in your former constituency.
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, I live in a coastal community, so hospitality and tourism is right up there in the sort of top of the, the sort of economic drivers for our area. And actually, one of the great things of not being an MP is you can go to all these places and not suddenly get your meal disturbed by somebody who wants to complain about how rubbish you are, or some latest abomination that's going on in Whitehall. And so I feel free again. It's interesting. I mean, there are. Let me have a think about this. There's some. There's a place which is just. It's been open a few years now. But there's a little place in my local town. I live near a town called Narberth, in the middle of Pembrokeshire, and it's very it's very successful little village / town. And two friends of mine opened up a cafe there a few years ago called Stopio, Stopio, and it's quite sort of homespun when you see it from the outside. But it was designed to be on the route of Ironman Wales, the big triathlon competition. So it's about halfway round. So it was meant to be a sort of destination for unbelievably fit and cyclists who would stop off and have a bit of grub. Anyway, it's turned into a sort of local mecca, and it's really good. And I mean, if anybody who visits it from London, it's over the equivalent of a sort of £50 note. So it's amazing. It's sort of 40 quid and change. It's just it's sort of a perfect example of a nice little community endeavour, which is always packed and always full of interesting, different people, and you get quite a lot of people in lycra, but you also get quite a lot of people like me not in lycra.
Yes.
Which so you won't put off your meal too much. That's a good one. There's a very top end hotel called the Grove, which is lovely. If you've got a special occasion and you've got a little bit of cash to blow, the Grove is. I think they've had all sorts of interesting people. Whenever there's sort of celebrity presence in West Wales, the Grove is always the place they go and have.
Would you count yourself as a celebrity in West Wales, Simon? That's got to be.
Do I count myself as a celebrity?
Yes, you're the celebrity presence.
No.
No.
It's amazing, by the way, for any budding politicians who listen to this podcast. One of the things that it's the most graphic and stark reminder of our place in society is the moment you cease to be an MP. Literally, the day after July 24, when we cease to be an MP, your phone goes dead. Your friends cut you off. And suddenly you go from relevant to irrelevant in like a blink of an eye. And all the people, I went from having 180 Christmas cards at Christmas to 20.
Jesus Christ. That's remarkable.
Literally, people consciously go, and it's probably more to do with me than that, consciously go to their address book and delete you.
Yes.
Which is a lesson in our sort of the disposable nature of politicians. So no, I don't. People do. I find nobody watching this will understand. People do stop me still, and say, has anybody told you you look like Brian Clough? And for people who don't know who the hell Brian Clough is, he was a manager of Nottingham Forest many years ago. And I do bear an uncanny. So anybody over the age of about 50 knows exactly what I'm talking about. And I thought, oh yeah, you do a bit. And I do have this weird resemblance to Brian Clough. But that is about my only.
Celebrity presence. Yes.
The weird thing I'm going to have to so now is just keep quiet while the speaker comes past me.
Oh.
The Lord Speaker's procession is coming past where we're
okay.
sat.
Oh, goodness me. Shall I quickly?
He's gone. He's gone.
It was gone.
Sorry,
He's
we're
gone.
in
That's
the
absolutely fine. That's gone. Say hi to him for me. This has been such a tremendous pleasure, Simon, to give us your insight on your time as chief whip and being a politician in general. I think you've been such good company. Make sure everyone to buy this thrilling book. Make sure everyone go on Amazon. We'll leave a link in the description. Please buy this book. It is just excellent. Simon, thank you very much for coming on.
Not at all. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Cheers now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.